Hello, everyone. I'm Ricardo Gamboa, the creator and the host of the Hoodoisie. We are Chicago's only and the country's only radical live and live stream news show disseminating Black optic and radical perspectives on culture and politics. And we are super excited to be bringing you this teaching series, Liberations in Black and Tan, that was incited by an eruption of racial tensions and brown on black violence that happened last week during the George Floyd protests. So we put this together to bring in Latinx professors from across the country to kind of talk about the issues that are at the root, and to also try and find ways to create multiracial solidarities and Black and Brown solidarity. So we're super excited to kick it off with this inaugural session. It features the author of the book, An African American and Latinx History of the United States, and the director of the Sam Proctor Oral History Program at the University of Florida. Everybody put your emoji clapping hands together for Paul Ortiz.
Thank you so much, Ricardo, and thank you all for joining us today, and thank you to the event sponsors, the sound engineers, the organizers, the labor that made this possible, and I'm just so honored to be here, and especially with you, and also with dear colleagues and friends. Some of us have been in kind of informal discussion this weekend. So there's going to be some themes you'll be hearing this weekend, which are kind of the perennial themes. Those themes are really focusing on organizing, social justice, like how we can use history and theory to ground our liberation work, and vice versa. So when we talk about issues of Black and Brown solidarity, one of the first things that we have to remember is that this is kind of forbidden knowledge, because we live in a capitalist society, and this is a society that's based upon exploitation. Now, we often talk about, capitalism is based upon competition, but at the bottom, it's based upon exploitation. Capitalism is based upon the expropriation of theft and destruction of indigenous cultures and lands in the Americas. Capitalism is born in slavery of enslaved African-American peoples. Capitalism progresses by dispossession of peoples, all the way back from the English dispossession of the Irish people in the 16th century to the continued exploitation of Native American lands and peoples. So that we are encouraged to be at each other's necks, at each other's throats. We are encouraged by our educational systems, by our political systems, by our governance systems to compete against each other. And on the other hand, so what I try to point out in African American and Latinx history in the United States is that examples of Black and Brown solidarity, examples of solidarity between people of the Americas, struggling people of the Americas, are unfamiliar to most of us. I certainly grew up almost completely ignorant of them. These examples of solidarity you're not going to see in Hollywood, television, or film. You're going to see white savior myths, right? This is because, for obvious reasons, the dominant society, and what I mean by the dominant society is the real powers of racial capitalism, do not want us to know about these examples. Again, we're constantly prodded into fighting a war of all against all. And so the concept of solidarity, which I really want us to think about this entire weekend, how do we build solidarity, right? The idea of solidarity is anathema to the people that run a society. And again, instead of solidarity, what they try to do is to shunt us or to maneuver us into things like philanthropy. Instead of teaching people how to fight for our own interests, we nurture middle-class so-called spokespeople, how to be advocates for other people's problems, and then nothing changes. So why is this knowledge about solidarity building forbidden? Why is it not taught? So one of the first things I want to share with you is Malcolm X. Malcolm X was a person who did intersectionality before intersectionality was cool. He was a person who traveled throughout the world, who learned about imperialism firsthand, who learned about anti-colonial struggle firsthand. And he came back to the United States and he started teaching people about what he had learned in Africa, in the Middle East, what he learned talking with Fidel Castro and other people in struggle, brothers and sisters in the Caribbean and in Latin America. What I learned from studying Malcolm X is that history is really at the centerpiece of what we need to be learning in terms of learning how to get free. This is a moment during 1962 when the Hospital Workers Union 1199 had just emerged, just literally hours before this event, victorious in a strike. And you'll see behind Brother Malcolm is this big marquee. Negro and Puerto Rican communities support Local 1199's fight to end exploitation. And the words that Brother Malcolm is sharing with us is really could be the title of my presentation today. And he's quoting a great Polish American labor leader, Leon Davis, who was one of the real organizers of 1199. And Malcolm is there to be in solidarity and support with the Black and Brown communities in this strike. And one of the main themes I want to share with you this morning is, if we're talking about solidarity, we have to be there for the people who we want to be in solidarity with. We have to take the blows that are meant for them. But the other theme I want to mention to you here is that this is a working class history. Black and brown peoples are going to be primarily working class peoples. And I want us to think about the implications for organizing. So here you have a strike, you have labor union members, hospital workers, Negro and Puerto Rican who come together in 62, and you have Malcolm X kind of bringing home these lessons about solidarity and political power. Let's think about coalition building, but what are the outcomes? In this case, he's trying to tell us about political power. I come to you today from Gainesville, Florida. That's where I'm joining you from. But every place where we're at today, every place where you're at, where you're watching, we all are living and working and watching on conquered land, an unceded land that originally belongs and still belongs to indigenous, to Native American people. And I want us to remember that, because when we talk about coalition building, when we talk about liberation and Black and brown solidarity, the hidden histories of solidarity between Native Americans and African Americans is very important. It's really central. Gainesville, Florida was a site of numerous battles, and you can see here in the image on the left, you can see Seminole warriors hiding, waiting to ambush soldiers of the United States Army. This is an example where Native Americans or Seminoles, Creeks, Miccosukes, and others joined together with former slave Africans to fight the United States government. When we think of the roots of anti-Black racism within the Latino diaspora at large, we got to go back to 1492. The Europeans bring ideas of race to the Americas with them. The great African-American scholar Cedric Robinson, in his book Black Marxism, kind of breaks this down. See, the Europeans racialized each other. I mentioned earlier the English going into Ireland and stealing their land, murdering people by the tens of thousands, deporting many Irish people. Well, the English did that to the Scottish people as well. The Western Europeans did that dispossession to the Eastern Europeans. And in 1492, the Spanish kingdom essentially unifies behind a few different ideas: anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim ideology, and anti-Black ideas. 1492 is the year that the Spanish consolidate and drive the last of the Moors out of the Iberian Peninsula, and then launch this devastating conquest of the Americas almost at the same time. So again, throughout the weekend, when we think about where these roots of racism come from in our communities, this is what we need to really understand. This is something that didn't exist in the Americas. It's the Europeans that brought it over. Now, how can we do this work, though, of solidarity? And I'm going to suggest a few different, possibilities and methodologies throughout history. One of them, Malcolm X brought to us in the beginning. Self-activity, go on strike, get in the streets, engage in an action. What I've learned in 30 years of organizing, and I started as a United Farm Workers organizer in the late 80s and early 90s, is that when you're talking about building solidarity between groups, whether they're African-American and Latinx or any groups, self-activity and action is really key. I mean, it's great to sit around a table and to talk about each other's feelings, but that ain't gonna cut it. What cuts it is action. Get involved in an action. Show up for someone else. Again, take the blows for them. Be there for them. In this case, Martin Espada, one of our greatest living poets, he does this work all the time. And I highly encourage you to pick up his works. See, this is radical intersectionality. He's connecting the struggle against slavery, the struggle against indigenous exploitation, and he's making it work together, and he's connected to the Nazi Holocaust, right? And so he's doing a lot of solidarity work in his poetry. And you don't have to be a labor organizer, you don't have to be in the streets if that's not where you can be, especially during this time of pandemic. Many of us have compromised immune systems, but you can write, right? You can share in many ways. Here's another example of solidarity practices. And now we're going back a century or more than a century, the Reverend Lena Mason. And what I found in the research for finishing this book is that within African-American political communities, and there is a long history of what I call emancipatory internationalism. And so in the 19th century, one of the manifestations of this is African-Americans writing and supporting liberation struggles in Mexico and Central America and Latin America. And Black writers and organizers like the Reverend Lena Mason, and here she's writing from Fort Scott, Kansas, recognizing that their freedom, their liberty, their possibilities in life are intimately connected to the struggles of, in this case, Cuban liberation fighters. The other thing I wanted to do in African-American and Latinx histories in the United States is to place the working class cultures and movements at the centerpiece of U.S. history. And the reason that's important is it's important to understand how we got to this place. The freedom that we do enjoy today, the freedoms, limited as they may be, come about because of our ancestors in struggle. They don't come about because Alexander Hamilton loved us. They don't come about because George Washington had our best interests in mind. Our freedoms and our democracy and what we have don't come about because Thomas Jefferson thought so highly of us. In fact, just opposite. All of the people I mentioned, Hamilton, Jefferson, Washington, had no love for us. We had no future in their world except for as beasts of burden, except for as impoverished, exploited people. And we need to realize that insofar as we have any rights in this country, it's because we have had ancestors courageous enough to struggle. I don't expect you would know who these individuals were because I didn't know until much later in life. On the left, though, is Ida B. Wells Barnett, who you may follow, was just awarded, I believe, a Pulitzer Prize, a century overdue for her work in unearthing lynching. On the right is General Antonio Maceo, one of the greatest revolutionary generals of all time. But what brings them together? Ida B. Wells Barnett does a lot of work in Chicago in the day, back in the late 19th, early 20th century. And Antonio Maceo fights in the field against the Spanish during the Cuban War of Liberation. What brings them together? And in this case, General Maceo had just been killed in battle in Cuba. And African-American communities, including in Chicago, there was a great meeting that was held. And again, think about this, over a century ago, in honor of General Antonio Maceo. And when he was killed by the Spanish, African-American communities all across this country mourned and cried and passed resolutions and promised their support for the Cuban liberation struggle. And yes, Mrs. Ida B. Wells Barnett the great anti-lynching activist, was there at this commemoration. She was actually on the platform to honor this fallen leader from the Cuban liberation struggle. Now, in my book, chapter 1, keys on the American Revolution, 1776, but my argument is that the Haitian Revolution is much more important for our purposes today, because it's the Haitian Revolution that abolishes slavery. It's the Haitian Revolution which throws out a lifeline to all of the struggling revolutionary independence movements in the Americas. It's the Haitian Revolution that gives enslaved African people in the U.S. hope. And it's the Haitian Revolution that is the revolution that this country and the leaders of this country to this day don't want you to know about. When we think about building Black and brown solidarity, we have to think about imperialism and anti-imperialism. We're constantly being chased. We're constantly in battle. I was a soldier of empire, by the way, in the mid-'80s. I served in U.S. Special Forces in Central America. I was sent to fight people who often looked like me and had my same last surname, right? But as a young boy growing up in this country, I didn't realize this long history of imperialism. Frederick Douglass here is recentering U.S. history as imperialist history. And until we understand that, we will never be able to talk about coalition building or solidarity. We have to understand what brought us together, the traumas, the tragedies. My family actually fled Mexico one evening in 1914 in the middle of the Mexican Revolution. We were not immigrants. That's a misused term. Number one, and the United States, as my comrade Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz points out repeatedly, we're not a nation of immigrants. We are a nation of refugees. We're a nation of former slaves. We're a nation of people who didn't cross the border crossed us. We're an indigenous nation that was expropriated, right? And so Frederick Douglass, again, gives us a sense for the meaning of U.S. history. One of the exciting things in doing this research is that in recent years, we've uncovered a whole cohorts of Latinx abolitionists, Californios, Mexicanos, people who in the West, in Mexico, fought ardently to try to abolish slavery. Again, this is in history. And one of the amazing things, when you read the book, African American Latinx History of the U.S., Chapter 2 is on the Mexican War of Independence. Well, what does the Mexican War of Independence have to do with U.S. history? What has to do with U.S. history, one of many things, is that Mexico abolished slavery long before the United States did. More African Americans found sanctuary, more former slaves found sanctuary in Mexico, probably than found sanctuary in Canada. But when we use the term Underground Railroad today, we've been so brainwashed to think of Underground Railroad as Canada. Well, there was an Underground Railroad to Canada. But guess what? There was also an Underground Railroad to Mexico, to the Bahamas, to Martinique, to places that were abolishing slavery while the U.S. was growing slavery. In Reconstruction, which politically speaking, for African American people is an incredibly stressful time full of possibility, but it's also the time of the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. Reconstruction, this is the period right after the end of the American Civil War. It's a time when African American men get the vote, but also immediately white supremacists try to steal the vote from them. It's a time when African descent people are desperately trying to gain some land and freedom. If they can't get 40 acres and a mule, then the plantation owners, the former slaves, are going to seize control back of the society. It's a life and death struggle for Black people coming out of emancipation. But instead of just thinking about themselves, instead of just saying and celebrating and saying, wow, we fought the Civil War, 250,000 of us fought the Union Army to keep the country together. Instead of just pulling back the fences and saying, now we got ours, Black people organize across the entire country to organize in favor and in support of the Cuban liberation movement. And so in 1865, at the end of the Civil War, the great white abolitionists William Lloyd Garrison says, okay, y'all, now it's time to kind of fold our tents, realize the historic work we've done. But, I'm tired, y'all. I need to go. I need to rest, right? This is exactly what Black abolitionists refused to do. And instead of resting, they said is we need to think about what would it say about us as a people if we say, okay, we got our own freedom, that's it. When the reality is that millions of people are still in bondage, in slavery, in Cuba, in Brazil. Now, these are some painful signs and images to look at. The next couple especially, I don't want to lie to you. But these are signs that some of us who are older grew up with. This is my father's generation. This was not my generation, but my father had to see these signs. And my family had to see these signs every day of their lives in the 1940s and the 1950s. We have to get beyond this understanding of race in the U.S. as a black and white issue. It's more complex than that. So this was a sign that was ubiquitous in South Florida during segregation. And it really puts it out there, right? It tells us that our people are not welcome here. We're not allowed here. But it also is divisive in the sense that it encourages us to engage in acts of self-hatred. Part of the struggle to become an anti-racist ally is to get rid of that, right? It's a long process. I grew up with the same thing. I grew up believing my own people were lazy. We hadn't done anything. We hadn't contributed anything to the society. We stole the jobs of Anglos, but we were also lazy at the same time. I didn't know how you could be lazy and steal someone's jobs, but I knew we did it, right? And until I was able to deal with my own level of self-hatred and what we call the imposter's complex, I wasn't a good ally because I had to deal with my own issues really through engaging in political struggle. When you read a mainstream newspaper like Washington Post or the Tribune or the New York Times in the 1920s, the white-dominated press refers to Augusto Sandino in Nicaragua as a criminal, as a rebel, as a person fighting against a righteous U.S. Marine invasion. But when you read the black press is clear. Hey, this guy's one of us. We all should know the work of W.E.B. Du Bois if we're interested in solidarity work. Du Bois was the author of the greatest work in Reconstruction called Black Reconstruction. That's a book that centralizes the black working class in the abolition of slavery, in the victory of the Union over the Confederacy. Du Bois's argument is that it's the black working class that's the central mover and shaker during what he calls the first general strike in American history. In 1928, Dr. Du Bois was asked to talk about why should the Negro fight to regain the ballot, right? And this was his answer. And I think it's so beautiful because, again, it's part of this long tradition of emancipatory internationalism and black internationalism. He's saying that, it's important to get the ballot back in order for economic survival, but we also have to look to the emancipation of our brothers and sisters in Haiti and Cuba, the Philippines and Hawaii. And we have to be aware about the government of American banks. And this is his jibe, not too subtle jibe, against racial capitalism. And kind of wrapping up, getting into the more recent present, and chapter 8 of my book was a really fun chapter to write because I could do oral histories with a lot of my former students who are now just kick-ass labor organizers. Some of them working on the Smithfield campaign, which eventually became successful. One of the amazing highlights of that campaign was a wildcat strike that occurred that was actually organized by Latino workers who were fighting, who went on strike for the right to celebrate MLK Day. Another kind of high point in chapter 8, I asked, how is it that the United States elects the first black president? And I root that in the 2006 general strike. I argue that it's the organizing energy that comes out of that strike in 2006 that makes it possible to elect Barack Obama to the presidency. I can tell you that the union that's being depicted here in this slide, the Culinary Workers Union, is the single most important labor union in learning about why Barack Obama is elected. This is a union that turns the tide, right? It has 60,000 members. It has members from over 84 countries on this planet. It's really the future of the labor movement.
I think, Paul, one of the things that's sticking out to me was, that sign from, I believe, the 50s, where it was, saying who's not allowed, and it had no dogs on there, presumably not just because they equated black and brown people to dogs, but because people were trying to bring in their dogs into those shops, which means that white people have loved animals more than people of color for decades now. And I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many ironies of that sign. Like, I talked to my father and my elders about that the last time I was in Houston. And they said, well, and my reputation is, I'm the younger, like, historian person, right? And they said, well, Pablo, here's the thing about that sign. We weren't allowed to go in the front of those stores anyway. And my father, worked in a restaurant that had one of those signs. And he said, I only saw that sign from the reverse because I was inside, he was a busboy. Mm-hmm. And so, but to me, that was a way of trying to, imagine what it was like to be, a parent during that time.
Right.
You're trying to raise your child with a sense of dignity, a possibility, and then you have to deal with that.
Right. From Anne, how do we find more information about the Underground Railroad to Mexico? I've heard that about 90% of blacks headed north and about 10% went south. But from what you said, it sounds like that percentage is wrong.
Yes, and that's a really good question. We're recalibrating that percentage. We'll probably never know exactly, what percentage, but let me break that down a little more. So in chapter 2 of the book, I talk about that, the Underground Railroad to Mexico. And I list a number of sources. I apologize. I usually would have and what I could do is send a follow-up kind of suggested reading list, Ricardo, which would have some of that information on it.
Let's do it.
And I will do that to break down some more, because a lot of this is newer research that we've kind of rediscovered. What I mean by this is that if you look closely at black abolitionists in the 1830s and 40s, what I do in chapter 2, people like Henry Highland Garnett, for example, who really rises to that forefront of the anti-slavery movement, Garnett is constantly talking about Mexico, how grateful our people should be to the brothers and sisters in Mexico, and how in many ways, even when you go further in history to Langston Hughes, he writes the great poem, one of the greatest poems in the history of this country, The Negro Speaks of Rivers. Langston is on his way to Mexico. He's a fluent Spanish speaker. His father is a successful black businessman in Mexico. And so, there's a lot of connections in the black diaspora into Mexico and Latin America.
From Yamali Rodriguez Gruger. And the question is, what do you believe is missing from current black and brown solidarity actions? And what can we do to improve or make more impact?
Well, I think what's missing is what we're doing here this weekend. And we're actually, I would look at what we're doing this weekend as a model for kind of plugging in some of the gaps. I'll be honest, by now, I'm a movement historian. And so my answer is going to be, it's going to come from my perspective. I was raised to really hate myself, my people, my background. I was raised to try to think about, how could I assimilate? How could I join the dominant society? And then I read something by Martin Luther King Jr. that said, why would I want to integrate onto a sinking and burning ship, right? And then I started reading things about, hey, my people had amazing accomplishments. And it wasn't just the Aztecs.
Paul, I want to thank you so much for coming here. If you were to give everybody a one-sentence takeaway to sum up what to think, and what would it in the next couple of days, what would it be?
Love yourself, love each other. Take care of each other, right? That's my takeaway, especially in this age of the global pandemic. But that the connection to respecting yourself, to respecting each other, reciprocity, be there for each other. Now it's a run-on sentence, right? I apologize. I'm a historian. I'm not an English professor, right?
This is so great. I'm definitely going to be in touch about bringing you out to Chicago to do one of these workshops the minute this lets up. And thank you so much, Paul. Once again, the book, I'm actually thinking that I want the Hoodoisie to even have kind of like a work group around it, is the African American and Latinx History of the United States. It's sold out right now, but you can pre-order it because Paul is doing it. This shit is catching fire, bro. So go ahead and pre-order it right now. And Dr. Ortiz, thank you so much for being here with us.